Hello there, my name is Prashant and today I'm going to talk about design thinking. In this video, I'm going to cover how design thinking is different from a traditional design process. And also I'm going to address some of the common misconceptions that are floating around in the industry that unfortunately is causing a lot of confusion, particularly into the minds of the younger generation of designers. Now, if I try to think about the reasons behind so much confusion around this concept, then I can kind of empathize with the people who get this wrong. And I think one of the main reasons is that the naming itself is quite confusing. For some reason, the founders of this particular terminology, which happens to be IDEO, if you don't know IDEO, look them up. They are a world renowned studio. They have chosen some very simple terms to name this methodology. Because of these very simple terms, it leaves room for confusion. It's very easy to confuse design thinking with thinking about design. And so many people I come across, especially the ones who have done not even the basic amount of research on the topic, would think that design thinking is actually just thinking about design, which is a very amusing and oversimplified understanding of what design thinking truly is. So, that I believe is a reason for confusion to begin with. But more than that, even if I go to the IDEO website and read through the documentation around this methodology, it doesn't sound very different from a traditional design process. And that causes a lot of confusion. In fact, I was also confused for the longest period of time because every time I read through the design thinking methodology documentation on IDEO website or somewhere else, for the life of me, I could not really figure out that how this methodology is different from a traditional design process, which we have always been following, especially the older generation like myself. We have been following this process since the beginning. I remember between 1997 and 2002, when I was finishing my architecture, we were using the same process. And what is this process? It's a 5-step process. It starts with empathy, then you define your problem, then you do ideation, you build prototypes, you test those prototypes, and then you go into an iteration loop to improve your design. So this process has always been around. We did exactly the same thing when we did architecture projects back in 1997 and early 2000s. We did our research, we went into the field, we went to the site, we spoke to the stakeholders, we gathered requirements. We even studied the climate of the place where we are going to build our project. And then we brought this research back. We defined the problem very clearly as to what is it that we're going to solve for. And then we did ideation. We went to the studios, made sketches, multiple directions of a design. We even did prototyping at different fidelity levels. Sometimes we made block models with styrofoam. Sometimes we made detailed prototypes, we tested those prototypes, and then we iterated on the whole process till the time we were happy with the design or the stakeholders were happy with the design. So we followed exactly the same process. And therefore, it was very confusing for me also to figure out that how design thinking now is different from how we were doing design always. Another thing that the design thinking methodology talks about is the fact that design thinking lives at the center of desirability, viability, and feasibility. Well, this has also been true for the longest period of time. In fact, in my mind, that's the default way in which a design works, a good design, anyways. And if you take any product from the history of design, you would realize that it is at least trying to strike this balance between feasibility, viability, and desirability. So that has always been the case also. So in this regard also, it was not very clear that why we need a new name now called design thinking to describe the same process. But I had faith in IDEO. I've been following them for the longest time, and I believed that they would not do something just for the heck of it. And there must be something which I'm missing that is different in this methodology than the previous way of doing design. So I carried on with my research. I read a lot of material. I read through IDEO documentation multiple times to find out that differentiation. And then eventually I came across this beautiful article written on the history of design thinking. I have included the link of the article into the description of this post. And if you are somebody who is interested in the topic of design thinking, I would highly recommend that you go and read this article from beginning to the end. It's a bit of a longish article, but it covers so many great names, so many great events that led to the conception of design thinking. Now, in this video, I'm not going to discuss everything about the history of design thinking. It's a very elaborate history and it's very well documented on that link anyway, so there is no reason for me to repeat all of that. But in this video, since the focus is on identifying the differentiation between traditional design process and design thinking, I will definitely use the part of the article which is relevant to the argument being discussed in this particular case. So if you want to understand the difference between design thinking and the traditional design process, we must understand it from the perspective of two schools of thought when it came to how to run design. In the third industrial revolution, which started around 1960s, I suppose, and up until 70s and 80s, there was a school of thought that was dominant in the continent of America. America was leading the industrial revolution, and obviously whatever they did over there was more popularly followed across the board. In this phase, there were a group of very talented designers, architects, engineers who were leading the charge when it came to product design. And their philosophy and their school of thought was that a design needs to be done by a group of subject matter experts, and they will observe the society around them, and then they will come up with products and services and solutions that are going to solve problem for the society and lead them to a better life. There was nothing wrong with this way of thinking. In fact, for the longest time, this has been a very successful way of thinking, and it has given us advancement in technology. It has given us some great products, and this way of thinking is a very legitimate way of thinking, and it has helped humanity for the longest time. One of the biggest names of this era has been of Buckminster Fuller. If you don't know who Buckminster Fuller is, I would say go and read about him. He was an amazing artist, architect, engineer, scientist even, and he has done some tremendous work in the field of industrial design. This era was dominated by people who were amazing at what they did, and they had gained knowledge about their subject matter, and society kind of trusted these experts to decide for them as to what is required. While this was happening in America, there was a second school of thought being practiced in Europe, particularly in the Nordic region, the Scandinavian region. And their belief was that if we have to design a product or a service for certain users and society, we need to involve those people into the design process in a bilateral manner. Now, don't get me wrong, it's not like that in the first school of thought, which is design led by a group of experts, there was no involvement of users or they ignored the users. Of course, there was definitely some research around users. They identified problems in the society and therefore they empathized with society and users as well. But their way of empathizing and researching was kind of unilateral. It was based on outside observation and it was based on some secondary research maybe, but there was not a direct involvement of the society and the end user into the design process. On the other hand, in the second school of thought, which was dominant in Scandinavia, Their belief was that we need to bring these people right into the design process. And not just end users, we also need to bring in experts from other non science fields like psychology, sociology. We even need to bring people from business. And in fact, they even brought people from seemingly unrelated fields like finance and accounting. So their belief was that if we are designing for society, then we need to bring all opinions from all around into the design process to agree to a solution that is going to be acceptable for everybody. Now, both of these philosophies were contemporaries. While one was being practiced in America, the other one was being practiced in the Scandinavian region. Somewhere around mid 80s and early 90s, this Scandinavian way of thinking about design made its way to mainstream America. Two individuals who are primarily responsible for this migration of thought process are the Kelly brothers. Kelly brothers were the founders of IDEO, and these two gentlemen were primarily responsible for bringing this Scandinavian way of participatory design into American mainstream. And they started evangelizing it and started practicing it into their projects. And they were, having some great success with it. Another thing that could be attributed to the difference in this way of working between the American continent and the Scandinavian countries could be the fact that traditionally America is a more individualistic kind of a culture, whereas Europe, particularly the Nordic region, has always been more of an egalitarian kind of a culture. While in US, individual glory, so to speak, for the lack of better term, and individual initiatives and achievements are celebrated. In the European culture, in the Scandinavian culture, they have never been like individual heroes, so to speak. The decision making is collective, everybody kind of comes together, and society operates as one unit. That has always been the culture. Now, the idea is not to deep dive into sociology here and investigate the roots of this difference, but I just wanted to mention that this cultural difference could possibly be attributed to the fact that both of these regions thought differently about how to run design. Anyways, as this second school of thought was gaining traction in mainstream America, eventually Tim Brown took over as the CEO of IDEO. And Tim Brown made it his personal mission to propagate this way of working when it came to design. And he was a big believer of this thought process of participatory design. And he wanted to take it to the world and show its benefits, demonstrate its benefits, and basically become an evangelist of this particular school of thought. For the purpose of making this methodology known to people more broadly, he sort of packaged this philosophy into a brand name called design thinking. And there were two components to it, the nature and the process. The nature being that design sits at the center of desirability, viability, and feasibility. And the process being a 5-step process of empathy, definition, ideation, prototyping, and iteration. So there was this part to it. And the second part to it was the philosophy of who participates in this process, which was the key differentiator. So he packaged both of these things together and called this whole thing design thinking. Unfortunately, when it comes to the documentation of this topic, this second part does not come across as the key differentiator. It's there, it's part of the documentation, but it does not get emphasized enough for people to understand that it is this second part which is the unique aspect of design thinking as a methodology. Because this other part of the nature of design and the process of design, like I have argued earlier in the video, has always been same. It's exactly the same. In fact, it cannot be any other way. It could change form a little bit, but fundamentally the process remains the same. So it was this second piece that differentiated design thinking, the second piece of participatory design, that was the key differentiator between the traditional design process and design thinking. Unfortunately, since this second part did not come across so obviously to people, and a lot of people were just speculating what design thinking means, anyways, that part got lost in translation. And I find it quite amusing when people come to me and say that your team needs to start practicing design thinking. But then when I ask them to hold workshops and I invite them into those workshops and I, ask them about ways in which we can bring more stakeholders into the design process, nobody wants to do that because that requires effort, right? Because that's not straightforward. You need to have skills, you need to know how to do facilitation, you have to be the common link between various stakeholders and opinion holders and the users, and you need to bring everybody together to collectively generate a set of diverse ideas and then converge those ideas into a common direction, a commonly agreed upon direction. And doing that is not easy. So it's easy to talk about design thinking, but design thinking is not just one part, the process part of it. Design thinking is also about the superimposition of participatory design philosophy on that process, which makes it design thinking. So therefore, every time somebody talks about design thinking, when I'm talking to my peers, leaders, other stakeholders, or anybody who's generally interested in the topic, I always say this, that if you say that design thinking is about making sure design is at the center of desirability, viability, and feasibility, and if you think that design is a 5-step process, then you do understand design thinking, but your understanding is only partial because you're missing the most important part, which is who's going to run this process. Is it going to be a single designer sitting in one corner on a desk in an organization, or a product manager baking the entire thing into their heads as the experts, or the same product manager or the same designer are going to come together and be the facilitators of collecting more diverse set of ideas from people coming from different domains. So it is not about the process, it's about who participates in that process and how that process is run. So that said, that was my analysis of how design thinking is different from a traditional design process. And I hope you liked the video. Thanks for tuning in. Thanks for your time. I'm gonna come back with another video on another topic on some other day. Till then, goodbye.